autism identification tends to lag amongst racially or ethnically minoritized youth. As evaluations are largely behaviorally assessed, when it comes to communication, social interaction, play, and any restricted and repetitive behaviors, what are some ways that therapists conducting autism evaluations might adapt in order to join in with the child's inner world? For children of color, what important cultural considerations should therapists explore and even challenge based on normative standards that might not fit for specific cultural upbringing? Welcome to People of Color in Psychology, the show that explores mental health topics specific to culture, diversity, and communities of color. I am your host, Jack Zen. Today we have Dr. Anitra Quinn. She is an award-winning school psychologist, mental health expert, best-selling author, and international speaker. Dr. Quinn specializes in the treatment and assessment of ADHD, anxiety, depression, and autism. In addition to her clinical work at Grace Autism Center, Dr. Quinn is the CEO and coach for School Excel, where she provides consultation and training with teachers, parents, and administrators to coordinate services for students with emotional, behavioral, and academic challenges. Dr. Quinn has held workshops on Black mental health awareness and talking to neurodiverse children about divorce. In addition to these professional roles, Dr. Quinn has also been asked to speak as an expert on radio and television pertaining to mental wellness, grief and loss, and anti-bullying. As an African-American psychologist, Dr. Quinn will be discussing culturally informed autism evaluation. Dr. Quinn, thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me, Dr. Jack. I appreciate the opportunity.
Well, this is such an important conversation because the area of neurodiversity is growing and services are beginning to emerge. Before we get into that, why don't you walk us through your journey and share with us any memorable events or circumstances that may have influenced how you got into this work?
Wonderful. I started out in school psychology, really focused on initially behavior management, psychoeducational evaluations. As a psychologist coming out of Mississippi State University, it was more behaviorally inclined. And so we didn't do a lot in terms of autism. But interestingly enough, when I moved to Houston, Texas to complete my internship, I had an amazing experience as a school psychologist working in schools. I had the blessed opportunity to work with a myriad of diverse types of disorders and atypicalities. Autism was one that really stood out to me because in so many ways, I saw myself. I saw myself as I was looking at students. And it was interesting because I remember initially thinking, I think I'm ADHD. I pretty much meet the criteria, very traditionally so. And then I started to recognize that there were things in my history that I recall that weren't explained by ADHD, and then that continued to pretty much show themselves in the current. And so I say that to kind of say that I know that my being in this field is not just happenstance or coincidental. It's so interesting because I remember when I would go in the grocery stores and I would always be drawn to squeeze the fruits and vegetables and the sensory component. And I remember not liking bright light. I remember I used to say, I can't stand bright light. I hope I'm not like a vampire. I don't like bright light. I have to keep it dark. But recognizing that it was because the bright light was overstimulating for me. And a lot of those atypicalities that I experienced, I now am able to take that into evaluations. Now, fast forwarding past my training and having been in the field for now over 20 years, 30 years. But interestingly enough, I ran, I guess 9 years ago, almost 10 in March, I had an amazing little boy, my son, my second son. And I will use that as kind of a catapult. When he was very young, I noticed some things, not just even before it was time for him to start talking, right? There were other little things that I picked up on that he wasn't doing, that you would see other kids do. He did the social smiling, but it wasn't necessarily, it was atypically social. He would smile, but it was never necessarily in response to something. I remember he would cry. Oh, he would cry whenever we would go into any type of places where there was any noise or it was bright or there were a lot of people. He would just cry emphatically. He would just cry. I remember the Santa Claus and all the things that people would do for holidays, get-togethers. He was just had such a difficult time with that. And so as a clinician, I knew what I was looking at. But honestly, Jack, I did not want to face it. I was afraid because I also myself, though I would oftentimes say, I think I'm on the spectrum or I think I'm ADHD, I never really truly sat down with the diagnosis and said, this is truly who I am. Okay. And so now here comes a time where I have to sit down with the diagnosis. And what I mean by that is sit down and take in account for what you see and recognize the beauty of it, but yet and still acknowledge that it exists. And so now I've been forced to do that because I have my little boy who really needs support. And so that drew my love even more out as it relates to looking at students, children with neurodiversities, adults with neurodiversities. And so having said all of that, I now, when I look at these evaluations, I recognize how important it is to make sure that they're not just good evaluations, they are evaluations that give parents an answer, that give parents what to do, because that's the most difficult part. As a clinician, I oftentimes get asked the question, well, what do I do? How do I respond? How do I know? And so all of these questions, I like to be able to give parents what they need and give schools what they need to be able to not just allow our students that are neurodiverse to survive, but to thrive. That is so important to me.
Yeah, I would imagine that when you learned about your son's situation and how he was responding to his environment, it was both shocking. I
Definitely.
wonder if there's a bit of sadness as well, because as you're aware, there are many structural systems that just aren't currently set up to fully provide the resources for students and kiddos who are neurodiverse or who have autism. And if there are inequity in resources, which is why I do think it's so critical that, and I'm so happy to have you on this particular episode, because you are talking about a culturally informed lens. So I'm wondering, from your experience, can you share with us some really key things that clinicians should really be looking for, assessing, or just even having conversations about in a way that is culturally relevant?
Definitely. As a school psychologist, I want to paint the picture. I was sitting on the opposite side of the table. And what I mean by that is I'm now not the one doing the evaluation and giving the results. I'm receiving it. So that was a very interesting situation for me because I am an expert when it comes to autism. So now I know that this is what I see, but I have to wait the process. And there were some challenges with that because a lot of the evaluators, they don't look like me. And my son's evaluators did not look like me. They were not people of color. And so, of course, I came into that. And when you talked about the sadness, not just with the initial fear of all of the things that research has told us, because we do live in a very structured world. We do live in a world that is very, there are no opportunities for lack of a better word, error, right? We live in a very interesting type of society when we look at how our schools are set up. From coming from a behavioral background, I remember hearing the term, why do we have kids do something only someone that's deceased can do? Sit in your seat, don't say anything, keep your hands to yourself, and all of these different parameters and things that truly do not allow a child that is neurodiverse to really explore their world, really become who they are. And so when it comes to these evaluations, now going into your question, as it relates to what psychologists need to be aware of, it's super important to, first of all, consider the true context. And what I mean by that is not just the context of the evaluation, but the context of the cultural aspects of the individual. And really allow yourself to be open to what is not textbook. Everything is not textbook. And I say that with respect to the text and to our theoretical orientation, but we have to be able to see between the lines. When you have a line, there is the black part or the blue part at the top and at the bottom that allows the white space in between, right? The black and blue parts are what are known. That's what we know. That's what we've been taught. That's what when we go back to our DSM, that's what we look at, right? But we have to be able to go in between into the white spaces, go into the gray areas, and allow ourselves to truly see kids and see their families when we're doing these evaluations. Because in my culture, there are some things that could easily be misinterpreted as being diagnostic, but they're cultural. Okay.
Oh,
So
what are those? Yeah.
For example, in our culture, sometimes I know growing up, you don't look someone in the eye, an adult, as a child, right? It can be considered disrespectful if you're being told to do something and you're kind of eyeballing somebody, right? And so things like that can be misinterpreted depending on where people grow up in my culture, okay? And even sometimes just the response could be considered talking back. When an adult says something, depending on where you grew up, wait until you're asked a question. You don't just kind of what some would consider talk back, or that could be considered disrespectful. Even I remember thinking about cultural psychology and cultural counseling when I took those classes, just some of the things that we have to be aware of in order to do a culturally competent evaluation. So you have to be willing to get the extra information, go the extra mile with your data collection to make sure that you have the clear context of what you see, okay? And so in my situation, from my evaluation with my son, clinicians were very careful because again, I was in the field. They know I was a former director of school psychology. So they were very, very aware, very cognizant of how to engage me. But yet and still there was a discomfort because again, in that arena setting, no one looked like me. And so it was uncomfortable. I have to say that. It was also, there were times where I felt like I needed to explain things because this is how we do things. And so I had to kind of reference some things. And so I really want psychologists, evaluators to know that when you're doing these evaluations, everything is not as it seems. Get enough data to validate what you think you're seeing. I'll give an example. I was recently evaluating a student of color, but not African American. The student was of Hispanic descent. And so I remember initially the referral was for autism, and in the classroom observation, it looked very much like we were looking at autism. But there was something I do not know why. All I can say is that gut feeling of, I need to look at him outside of the classroom. I need to take this further. Something just is not. I remember as I was sleeping thinking, no, I need some more information. Yes, he's very withdrawn. Yes, he is not exhibiting eye contact. He is not connected with the environment. He's not doing all the things that our kids with AU typically would do, but I just need to be sure. So I contacted the mom and said, is there a way that I can do a virtual observation just while he's playing at home? You can set your computer up or your phone. I just want to see. It was a totally different kid. I was like, the committee and I were just this close to making the recommendation for autism, but something just, I couldn't. And when I saw this little boy who was he was in his world, he was having a blast, he was playing with his brother, he was interacting, whereas he was not talking at all in the classroom. He was not interacting, he was very withdrawn. When I saw him in the home environment, it was like night and day. And we know that autism doesn't turn off. Our neurodivergent kiddos can't turn it off like a light switch. We know that. And so I immediately began to look at other diagnoses and consider other options. I really delved into the cultural components, and what we ended up identifying the student as was selective mutism. But again, this was a whole team that thought they were looking at one, but there were so many other components, and there were some cultural things and some historical in terms of his history. But again, this is why it's so important to go the extra mile, collect enough data. Don't be afraid to ask the hard questions. You know, typically we don't ask to do an evaluation virtually when we've already done it in the school setting, right? But I knew that I needed to do something to see him in his domain, because something wasn't, I still can't tell you to this day what made me so just honed in on, I've got to see this kid in another setting. But at that particular time, I felt that it was necessary, and the committee was blown away, because I also had a couple of them tune into that observation, and everybody, we did a second one so they could see, and they were just flabbergasted that this is not the same kid. Wow. So don't be quick to make your diagnostic impression. Take the time to truly see the child through a culturally sensitive lens. Be willing to go further. Be willing to ask, again, the hard questions.
Wow, that's such an important consideration. And you knew in your gut that something was off, to the point where you were literally laying asleep at night wondering, wait, so something's not right here. And to take that extra mile, as a mother, the impact of these evaluations. And so you want to make sure it's done correctly, accurately, so that necessary accommodations can be made.
Very true, very true. In school settings, it's very interesting. We have to make sure a school is like a little community. I would say it's pretty much like its own little city. And in this city, everybody has to have what they need to be successful. They all live in one house, but they have to have the things in that house to allow them to be able to successfully navigate the house, if that makes sense. And so just like in our homes, everybody has a refrigerator, right? In terms of our physical homes, when you look at a child in a school that is neurodiverse, just as important as that refrigerator, they need those visuals. They need a routine. They need that structure. And the same thing at home. But at schools, we have to be able to give that, because again, we're expecting them to do a lot of different things. There are a lot of academic demands put on our kids in schools. And so when they don't have their refrigerator and they've got all these academic demands, then look how confusing that can be, right? And so I think we have to be creative enough to put together a plan that will allow that child to be able to walk like everybody else as best he can, and do it to his own beat. Allow him to walk at his own drum. Allow her to walk at her own drum, right? Her own speed. And we can do that.
Connecting this idea of culturally informed evaluation, which is thinking about, well, it's not just a school system they're in. What about their natural cultural environment, which is with the family at home, and looking at the behaviors that way? And it's amazing you're able to do this virtually and get that data point. Wow.
Definitely. And I will tell you something, COVID taught us a lot. And I say that because we were all forced to do virtually, right? And what I found, and I was telling someone else this on another platform, that I remember my first virtual evaluation, I got the most rich data that I've ever seen in my life as it relates to the observational data. Because parents would just literally sit their phone up, like over in the teddy bears or something, and I would see kids doing all sorts of stuff. From scaling the couch to, I would see if they were able to do make-believe play. I saw that in real time. And I saw how the parent was responding. I got to see dynamics that I wouldn't typically get to see. And it really allowed me to tap into the component of the culture that you may not see at home. Because in addition to our origin and our culture in that sense, we have the culture of a family. Every family has a way that it navigates. And when you can see the beauty of that and how that child responds, it can truly give amazing insight. It truly can. So for my own son, I will tell you something. I started a YouTube channel years ago called Autism Answers. And what I did is I started to take video footage of everything Kid was doing. Because I recognize that with our kids with autism, it's not so much what they can't do or can do, it's what they're willing to show you. And if you can get into their world and allow them to show you, they can show you some pretty amazing stuff. And so what I did is I chronologed his behavior, chronologed his development and what he knows. And then I wrote out this entire comprehensive academic competencies, and I allow for other people to get into Caleb's world, to see him, to see how he is right now. He's reading this book, my mom's book, Dick and Jane, from a long time ago, but he's reading it, and he's reading it happily with no assistance. He can, and it's so funny because in watching him do that, we get up in the morning and I let him do that piece. Well, if he goes to school and he's not performing, then it may look like it's a can't do problem. But I have the video footage here, and it's not a can't do. And it's not even a won't do. It's I don't have what I need to do. Okay.
Oh, that's such a important caveat. I don't have what I need to do what I would like. Huh. Well, Dr. Quinn, as we're talking about this culturally informed evaluation, do you have any other thoughts related to it that you would like our listeners to know?
Definitely. I think it's important to step outside of the box when you're doing these evaluations, because again, we have to get in their world. And so getting in their world may mean having that conversation with, and I know most psychologists and therapists will ask, what do they like? But use that in your evaluation. For example, I had a kid who really liked these little, these cards. What are they? Pokemon, right?
Oh, yes.
So and I did this virtually too. So I had my Pokemon cards, but I also pulled the Pokemon visuals on the internet, and we were able to interact. That was the only way I could truly get in his world. And
so you're actually interacting with the kiddo through their interest to get the data. Yeah.
That's the only way. You can knock at the door, but the question is, do you have what I need that's going to make me want to let you into my world? So when I have the Pokemon card and I'm knocking, and it's hypothetically, I'm knocking, right? I'm knocking at your door. When I have this card, I'm in. We can talk about anything. I had another kid. His whole thing was dinosaurs. And I love to do different voices and roars. I do all of that stuff. And so I get into their world. I become what they need to make this session palatable enough for me to pull data out. And I don't even have to pull, they give it to me willingly. They give it to me willingly. Whether I'm changing my voice or whether I'm doing silly stuff, whatever I need to do, I'm going into your world. I want you to invite me into your world. So let me show you that I appreciate your world. Let me show you that your world is valuable enough to me. Because one of the things that happens, and this is no pun intended to parents, but we tend to, sometimes we're so busy with our days when they're showing us, the brontosaurus 25,000 times. Sometimes it's like, okay, mommy saw it. Okay. But as therapists, what we can do, we can bridge that gap by allowing ourselves to get into their world, become a part of it. They'll take you around and they'll show you who they are. They will give you what you need to be able to make not only just a good diagnosis, but make a decision that will frame and shape their life. And that's so important.
Well, thanks for sharing that, because you're really talking about appreciating their world and joining them. Yeah. Yeah. I asked this question to all our speakers, and that is, in your career as a person of color, what were some of the challenges that you faced and overcame that you would be willing to share?
Wow, that's an amazing question, Dr. Jack. I have to say, let me preface this by saying I am from Mississippi. I hail from the great state of Mississippi, the Magnolia State. And I have to say that because I had a very interesting experience as I entered into my field of study, in preparation for my field of study. It was very, very challenging, not the work, but the difference in how I versus my non-African American classmates, peers, cohort were treated. It was a very different experience. And I say that because the other African American and non-white colleagues experienced the same thing. We've had conversations about it, even to this day. As a matter of fact, just last week, some people were talking about it. But so what does that mean? What that means is the expectation was different for us. We didn't have some of the same opportunities. I remember, I'll share some insight. I remember literally having to go out and seek out my own experiences for whether it was practicum and just some of the typical, and I say seek out. I remember as a graduate student, I wanted to do testing. I had a psychometry license, and that's that first level. And I was able to get a contract at one of the neighboring districts. And interestingly enough, they called me and they said, the university called and said, we can't support your contract, even though you've done great work for us and we truly appreciate it. We hate having to do this, but they said, if we support your contract, they'll pull all of their contracts.
Right. That makes absolutely no sense. In fact, I'm thinking for a master level student to have secured their own practicum placement and get paid for that, you should be rewarding that student as a advisor or faculty member.
Exactly. I actually, at that point, I had already completed the master's and I was getting the doctorate degree, and I was doing testing as a kind of like a second, not really practicum, but it was additional experience that I really needed and wanted to do, and I was good at it. And so that happened. Then I remember just some of the most interesting, oh my goodness, and I'm going to share this because this truly happened. And taking the doctoral comps, and we had been given like 30 questions, I think, or something. We had to divide them up and study them, and everybody had to do different ones, and they were supposed to exchange them. And so I had some of my non-African American colleagues that were also not people of color failed to give me the remaining comps. And so we were all scheduled to exchange what we'd written, like 20 pages on, so everybody could study them equally. But somehow I was left out of that. But I thank the Lord that I passed unanimously because I knew the content anyways. But it's just the fact that things like that happen. There was a lot of discrimination in my program. I'm not happy about that, but I was able to come through that, and I have voiced concerns about that. I remember just multiplicity of things that occurred that not just showed me that there was a discrepancy and inequality, but it was very blatant. There were very blatant things that were done and said. I was asked questions by some of the faculty that were culturally insensitive and inappropriate about people of color, just different things that were not appropriate. So I definitely have experienced a plethora of things as a graduate student when I was working on both my master's and my doctoral level degree. So I say all of that to say that we still live in a world, in a society where there's inequality as it relates to higher education, even as it relates to undergraduate, but truly in higher education in a field that is highly dominated by Caucasian males. And so we still see a lot of those, literally those barriers that create the perpetual glass ceiling that for many, they're still trying to break through. We all are, right? And so I really appreciate you doing what you're doing with this podcast station, because it brings to light that thing, I say that thing, that issue that we don't want to talk about, because when you get past it, you just want to throw it under the rug, but it deserves being talked about because there are so many people that are still experiencing it.
Yeah. Well, thanks for sharing that with us. And it really is true that, a lot of the theories that we read about in school are written from a Eurocentric perspective. And the hope is just through our efforts, organizational efforts, people being more aware that we do need to provide a shift in how we do interventions. What does it mean to do culturally informed treatment, right? This is what we're talking about here today in the context of autism evaluations.
Mhm.
And so having faced some of those challenges for you, what kept you going?
I love being asked that. There's truly, I have to say there's one foundational, and then there are other, picture it like this, the ground level and then what sprouts up, and then I'm on top. Okay, so at the ground level, my faith. My faith. My faith is what kept me going. Knowing that, God had a plan for me, has a plan for me. There's purpose in my life. I'm not here by happenstance. I'm here because there is a greater good. There's a greater need. There's a greater call. There's a greater opportunity. And I have an assignment that I will complete. So I have to complete the task because there are people that are attached to my assignment, right? So that was important for me. But then sprouting up from that foundational of the purpose in God is that I have to be able to extend the torch to someone else. It's important for me to extend the torch to make sure that the next person is able to overcome the challenges and be a part of this amazing field to change lives. Kids need to see evaluators that look like them. That's so important, because I remember one little guy I was evaluating, and I remember him saying, because I was looking at the previous data and it had him as ID, and I'm like, this kid's not ID. There's no way. And it had he wouldn't respond. It was all because he was not responsive to the evaluator. And so when I was talking to him, I said, you told me all this stuff. I said, dude, what's up? What happened? He was like, Miss, she don't know my world, Miss. She don't know what I go through, Miss. You
Didn't trust her. You didn't trust his previous evaluator.
Exactly. And so he had been misdiagnosed. This was his 3 years. So he carried an ID diagnosis for 3 years. It made I still to this day I'm flabbergasted by that. But so I say all of that to say, it for me, it was being the one that can reach one, And then of course, at the next level is my family, my children, and that kind of thing. But and so it didn't just keep me going then. Those same things keep me going now. They keep me going now.
Yeah. Well, Dr. Quinn, it's a delight to have you on this podcast. And it's amazing that you're doing this type of work also with Dr. Reyes. All of y'all are doing just amazing work. How do we support you?
I want to put this out there. Grace Autism and Neurodiversity Center, I have to give kudos there. It is such a blessing to be able to connect with families because, again, there's still such a stigma around autism and around people feeling comfortable and us being able to truly allow for people that are different. We all have different brains. Our brains may work different ways. It doesn't make me more valuable or this other person more valuable or me less valuable. So I love that Grace Autism and Neurodiversity Center actually allows that platform that embraces those differences and loves on people where they are to provide them the support they need. So I can be supported definitely through reaching out. I do have a lunch and learn on Wednesdays, which is awesome. It is virtual. Parents can tune in and get information and just really, because what I found, even myself as a parent of a little one with autism, it can be very challenging, not just with not my son, but just with other people, the eyes that are analyzing and watching as you go places. And if he makes a noise, people are looking and so it's important to have that safety and security in numbers and knowing that people support you and there are other people out there like you. So the lunch and learn is a great opportunity for people to get that kind of support and understanding. Also, I do parent coaching, which can it can be individualized, or it can be in a group, and that's scheduled based on people's schedules and things like that. But definitely, I'm excited to be able to be doing that. I also obviously do individual educational evaluations, which I love doing, and I advocate for parents and that kind of thing. But I also speak nationally about psychology, obviously, neurodiversity, and in a variety of other ways as well, but keynotes, all that kind of stuff. Definitely, I can be supported via those avenues.
All right, Dr. Quinn. Well, thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.
I hope you liked this episode. Please subscribe and share. We love to hear from you, so send me a message on LinkedIn or email. The People of Color in Psychology is brought to you by the Multicultural Counseling Institute, and I'm your host, Jack Tsen.